Hey guys, welcome to the first section of the first chapter in the Facebook and Google Chrome Store app series. In this section we're going to be talking about HTML5 and CSS3. Both of these are pretty crucial in not only Facebook app development but any kind of app or website development. Any developer at this time in 2013 or later should have a pretty good understanding of HTML5. It's quickly becoming a standard, and we're seeing more and more websites and apps use HTML5 over XHTML. So let's first talk about what's new in HTML5 as opposed to older versions. These are just some of the new features and aspects. We have a whole new tag structure. So now we have, instead of having to use div tags, we can still use div tags, and it's recommended to, but we can substitute some of those with the new tags, such as the header, the footer, the A side tag, which is meant for sidebar content. And I'll go over these fields, these tags in the next slide. Video and audio support. We can actually embed video and audio right into an HTML document instead of having to use a plugin like Flash or Silverlight or something like that. So that's very useful. And then we have these other features which we're not going to really be using in this series, but are very cool. We have the geolocation feature, web storage, which pretty much replaces JavaScript cookies, canvas, so we can draw elements, shapes. Same thing with SVG, which is scalable vector graphics. We can actually use HTML5 for animation and graphics. And then we have app cache, which helps with offline web development. And so those are some pretty cool features that are pretty advanced. So we're not going to really go into them. We're just going to go over what each one is. So back to the tags. You can see we have header, footer, A side. We have the nav tag for navigation. So basically we'd have the opening nav, and then we'd have the unordered list menu, and then the closing nav tag. So we can use that for CSS styling, JavaScript, whatever. Then we have the section and article tags, which are basically would wrap the main content area. And then we have the main tag, which usually you would use one main tag, kind of like a wrapper or a container div, pretty much in the same way. Then we have the audio and video tags, which can easily embed audio and video. So here's an image of a common structure or layout of an HTML5 website. We have the header, then the navigation, the main content, and the articles and section. Then we have the A side tag, which is pretty much sidebar or sub content, and then we have a footer. So pretty simple. You can see that these tags help us lay out websites and apps much easier. And we still would use div tags, div and span. Those definitely aren't going anywhere anytime soon. Document structure. Here's the code, not the exact version of that image, but this is a common layout. We have the doc type. This is a doc type for HTML5, much shorter than the XHTML doc type. We have the head, the body, which is nothing new. And then we have the main tags, which is pretty much used as a container. And then the header, nav, section, sidebar, and footer. So very simple layout. Alright, so let's go over the new input types of HTML5. One of the most handy, in my opinion, is the email field. And the reason for that is it validates the field, it validates and makes sure it's a valid email without having to use JavaScript. So if we use input type email and someone types in something that's not an email address, it'll pop up and not let us submit the form, and it will tell us to put a valid email in. And in the past, to be able to do this, we'd have to use quite a few lines of JavaScript. So that's really useful. Number field is obviously used for numbers. This also validates. We can have a range, which gives us a range of numbers. Color and date are also really cool because we don't need JavaScript. We can have a color picker and a calendar picker without having to use JavaScript, which is really nice. Okay, so we can also have a month field, search, which basically works like a text field, time, URL. So if we want the user to enter a website and it's not a valid website, that will also be validated. And then we have a week. We can select a certain week, and we have telephone number field. So you can see these are all very handy. In the past, usually we would use a standard text field, and we'd have to validate it ourselves through JavaScript. Audio and video support. We can now embed audio and video without having to use Flash or Silverlight. This is an example of a video tag. We have the opening tag, which has the height and width attributes. We can choose if we want to show controls or not. And then under the video, the opening video tag will have as many source tags as we want to point to as many different formats or versions of the movie or the video. For instance, here we have an MP4, but if the browser we're in doesn't work with MP4 video, then it would move on and it would try the OGG version. So you can have as many of these as you want. If for some reason you're using a really old browser that doesn't allow any of these, it'll just give you a message. We can put this message telling them that they need to update their browser. So next we have the web storage feature, and the web storage basically replaces the need to use JavaScript cookies. And I'm sure you know that cookies are basically just small bits of information that are placed in the user's browser, and the script can then use those values later on. Alright, so web storage is faster and more secure than using JavaScript cookies, and also easier. Down here we have a perfect example of how it works. HTML5 web storage works in key value pairs, and we have the key, which we created this local storage dot first name, the key, and then Bob is the value. Now this local storage here, we have local storage, and then we can also use session storage. The only difference between the two is that the session storage variable or value will clear when the browser's closed or when the session ends. The local storage API will actually just stay until the user erases it or clears their cache or whatever the case may be. So we've set a first name and a last name of Bob Sampson. Now this line here, if you know JavaScript, then you know what this line does. For those of you that don't, what we're doing is calling this getElementById method, which is part of the document object. Okay, so we want to get the element by ID of welcome, and that would be this here. Okay, so this is the div with the ID of welcome. Now we're calling this method on that object. Okay, so the inner HTML method, what it does is just inserts HTML. And what we want to insert into that HTML is this here. So we have the text welcome, just a regular string welcome, and then a comma. And now we want to use this first variable or value. Alright, so we have to concatenate. Since this is in JavaScript and not plain text, we have to concatenate with a quote and then a plus sign. Alright, so we want welcome first name, and then we want to concatenate again a space, so we have a space between Bob and Sampson, and then we concatenate again and add on the last name. Alright, so this code will insert welcome Bob Sampson. Alright, so that'll insert that there. Now if we're using the local storage API, then the next time the user, even if they close the browser and come back, it'll still welcome them. Alright, so if we use the session storage, it'll clear, but if we use local storage, it'll stay there. Alright, so it's very useful to just create session variables and use them in whatever way that you want to use them. So here we have some other features of HTML5, which I'm not really going to get into because we're not going to be using. Geolocation basically allows us to grab a user's position through GPS or Wi-Fi or some other methods, but the user has to approve it. A pop-up will come up and they have to click allow in order for us to get their location, and then we can use it however way we want in our application. App Cache usually deals with offline web pages and web browsing. Canvas and SVG, they have to do with animations and graphics. We're not going to get into, but SVG, which is scalable vector graphics, allows you to have vector graphics, which are images that don't lose quality as you grow them or maximize them. So it can be very useful when you're doing graphic intensive type stuff. So that's it for HTML5. Now we have just some of the new features of CSS3. Of course, CSS3 is backward compatibility with CSS2, so basically it just gives us some extra things to work with. For instance, rounded corners. We have the new border radius property, which allows us to create rounded corners without having to use images. And same thing with text effects and shadows. You would have to use an image for a shadow, but now we can just use CSS. Animations, we can have certain objects kind of animate from one style to the next. So for instance, we could have a color property go from red to a color property of green, kind of fade in and out. So you can do different things with animations in CSS3. Media queries, which allow us to have responsive templates, pseudo classes, and new colors and color functions. So like I said, rounded corners allows us to have rounded boxes without having to use images, and we can do this through the border radius property. Okay, so we want to set a border and then set the radius. Now 10 pixels is going to be a slight curve. We could maximize it. We can make this 50 pixels and it'll make it more round. So the higher the pixels, then the more rounder it's going to be. Now if we call this here, this property, it makes all the corners of the object rounded. But we could just round certain corners, top left, top right, bottom left. So we could have a box that has rounded corners on the top and then straight on the bottom. And in some older browsers you might need to use this. This MOZ works for Firefox, for older versions of Firefox, and WebKit works for IE and Safari. I think that, I'm not really sure which browsers use which, but to be safe you might want to just add this under your standard border radius value, or property. So next we have media queries, which allow us to have dynamic responsive templates or designs, because we can actually set certain CSS properties for certain screen types. So we can check if the user is on a desktop that say is maybe above 1,000 pixels, or we could check if they're on a mobile device that maybe is more like 400 pixels, and we can set, for instance, here we're setting the background black for screens that have the max width of 500 pixels. So if the screen is more than 500 pixels, it's not going to have this property. Okay, and we can also set ranges. So let's say we have the minimum width of 501 and the maximum width of 900 pixels. So if the screen is anywhere in between those, then we could change the background to black. So this allows us to have fully responsive designs using CSS media queries, instead of having maybe separate websites for mobile and tablet, because that can get really messy. So this is definitely the suggested way to build responsive websites. So CSS3 can also do animations. I personally don't have much experience working with CSS3 animations, but I have seen some really cool stuff. And the way it basically works is that it allows an element to gradually change from one style to another. So as a very simple example, let's say we have a paragraph that has a color property of red, so just red text. We can have that element fade into the color property of green, so it'll show the text gradually fade from red to green. That's probably the most simple example I can explain, and it's all done by using the keyframes rule. This paragraph here is from W3 Schools. The keyframe rule is where the animation is created. Specify a CSS style inside the keyframes rule, and the animation will gradually change from the current style to the new style. So basically what I just told you with the text. If you want to know more about animations, W3 Schools is a great place to start. So that's it. That's the gist of most of the features, all the popular features of HTML5 and CSS3. So next, I believe we're going to get into JavaScript and have a JavaScript crash course. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next section.